Why are horror movies today so different from the horror movies of previous generations? Horror movies have scared audiences since their inception, but they've had to change with the times to find new ways to frighten audiences. As filmmaking technology and the culture of the audience has changed over time, so too has the genre evolved to match what will be the scariest. As the film industry matures, so does the horror genre, going from simple stories about monsters to allegorical, elevated horror films that focus on more complex ideas like trauma and grief. In this video, I'm going to look at the roots of horror films in the silent era and look at how they changed, what caused the change, and examine what elements have persisted across horror films. Silent horror films were more similar to folklore storytelling, like stories you might tell around a campfire, reflecting how new the medium was at the time. Before silent films developed true narratives, short horror films focused on ghosts, goblins, and haunted houses. You have films like The Haunted Castle, which are tame and silly by today's standards, but back when this came out, it was a ghost story, and that's really all you would get from a horror-style movie. Just as the film industry was new and hadn't grown to a level of complexity, these early horror films were simple, similar to a spooky folktale. Over time, as film technology becomes more advanced and film audiences grow, the subject of these horror films become more complex and become grounded. Silent horror films with narrative stories were similarly focused on the supernatural, but with more nuance, with Phantom Carriage, for example, following a ghostly embodiment of death that visits a man and shows him how evil he has been in the past, similar to A Christmas Carol. This film uses the supernatural covering of a ghost to tell a story. The fear makes the story and morals of the film more effective by scaring the audience into being good people, and it uses a really interesting visual technique to make the title carriage appear ghost-like. The most effective films in this silent period were mostly about vague, supernatural evils, typically a personified death or some general fear, because that's all the filmmaking of the time and the audiences of the time were able to support. The tools early filmmakers had to work with didn't allow for nuance in the same way as modern films, because you couldn't have complex dialogue and you were limited in what the camera could do. Even something with a monster-type character like Nosferatu is less about the vampire himself and more about the fear he causes, serving as an emblem of fear more than a specific monster terrorizing people like in a later film like Godzilla. Hexen is another silent horror film that is literally a collection of campfire stories about witches, but less in a literal sense and more focusing on the hysteria of people in relation to the fear of witchcraft. The film is structured like a documentary and an anthology, documenting beliefs about witchcraft and how medieval societies reacted to the fear of witches. The film is so fascinating because of the visual style it has and the way it commits to the idea that it's documenting history. The best scene in the movie is a depiction of a witch gathering that combines these two aspects, presenting an eerie, shocking scene with set design that is unlike anything I've seen in a silent film before. It's so interesting because it does so much with the limited tools of the time, both in terms of its visuals and its plot structure. The silent horror era is characterized by relying more on scary atmosphere and visual spectacle to frighten the audience compared to a specific slasher villain in later horror films. As filmmaking advances with time, directors get the ability to tell more complex stories. Audiences become more accustomed to the idea of a horror movie, and the horror genre enters the age of the monster movie. In the 1930s, Universal made a series of monster movies, starting with Dracula and Frankenstein in 1931. Compared to the monsters in silent films, these monsters were more complex and felt more like proper characters than just an obstacle. Compared to Count Orlok and Nosferatu, Bela Lugosi's Dracula character is much more prominent, and Boris Karloff's monster in Frankenstein is a complex, sympathetic portrayal of a gothic horror icon. These two films paved the way for numerous other monsters and sequels from Universal, including The Wolfman, The Invisible Man, and The Mummy. These films took the characters of gothic literature and fleshed them out more with the advances in filmmaking since the silent era. Silent film adaptations of these stories would have been more straightforward adaptations of the stories, and you see that with Nosferatu, but Universal's monster movies bring a twist to the stories with more nuanced themes and better production budgets. After World War II, in the backdrop of the atomic age, monster movies shifted to be more focused around science fiction themes, with American films like Creature from the Black Lagoon and The Blob both being iconic sci-fi monster films, but the best in my opinion comes from Japan in 1954, with the release of Godzilla. Godzilla was created specifically as a metaphor for the atomic bomb, and served to help Japanese audiences work through the trauma of World War II. It shows Godzilla as a monster created accidentally by science that destroys Tokyo before being destroyed by even more powerful science. The end of the film is sympathetic towards Godzilla because it's just a creature that was drawn onto land after being attacked by the military, and in that way it's not too different from Universal's Frankenstein film. Monster films take the stories that provided the backbone of silent films and elevate the characters and themes into something representative of the maturing film industry. Silent horror films felt like just reading the original work, and monster movies made the horror villains feel a bit more real and more complex than just an evil figure, a trend that's continued as the monster movie craze is replaced with the slasher movie craze. In the late 60s, the Hays Code, which was responsible for widespread movie censorship since the 1930s, was repealed, opening the door for movies to include more violent and objectionable content. This new freedom also led to an explosion in the horror genre, as films could be more explicit with their violence and shocking content compared to the tame, allegorical nature of the Universal Monsters era. This era in American filmmaking was called the New Hollywood movement, and one of the first horror films to take advantage of this new frontier was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974, followed shortly after by Halloween in 1978, both of which were inspired by Psycho in 1960. Although influential to the slasher genre, I would consider it a slasher film in the same vein as those other films because only 2 characters die and the slasher villain isn't actively attacking people. Texas Chainsaw Massacre was one of the earliest and certainly most successful films in what would be considered the early slasher genre. It greatly utilizes the freedoms afforded by the removal of the Hays Code to create a terrifying atmosphere that covers the entire film. Everything feels gross, with set design made up of bone decorations and animal carcasses. The film follows a serial killer and his cannibal family as they kill a group of friends, and Texas Chainsaw is so influential because of how shocking it is even today, but especially when it released in 1974, shortly after the Hays Code had been repealed. 4 years later, John Carpenter takes the terror of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and refines it a bit to create Halloween. This film was huge and had everything you would expect from a slasher film. You have a terrifying villain with great visual design. It all takes place within the safety of a suburban neighborhood, and it's simply terrifying. This film opened the door for countless slasher films and slasher franchises to follow in Halloween's footsteps. In the 80s, we get multiple films from Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the start of Child's Play, among others. The slasher genre started to fizzle out by the 90s due to studios frequently churning out bad entries in popular franchises, with nonsense movies featuring Jason Voorhees in New York and the death of Freddy Krueger. The final nail in the coffin, in my opinion, is the release of Scream in 1996 because of just how good it is. It both makes fun of the genre and perfects the genre to the point where you really can't have an old-style slasher anymore, and anything low budget would just be compared against the Scream films. Compared to the monster movie era, slasher films are more grounded and human. Even if some of these films do have supernatural elements, like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, they're mostly just human killers that terrorize a group of people. The final step into modern horror films is to go from real human killers to just real people with a slightly supernatural twist, as seen in the elevated horror films of Jordan Peele and Ari Aster. Elevated horror, in my opinion, refers to horror films that are more subtle in their portrayal of evil, replacing the killers of slasher movies with villains that are more or less just people. Get Out is just about a family, Midsommar follows a cult, and Hereditary is a bit of a mix of both. To me, the most common element of elevated horror is that it doesn't focus as much on trying to scare the audience as it does using a scary situation to develop theme. This isn't a bad thing by any means, just a departure from what came before it. It's not a name I like, but the term is very prevalent in discussions of the modern horror landscape. It's also not exclusive to modern horror films. I would argue that The Shining and even Ginger Snaps could fit into the modern definition of elevated horror. Both of these films are highly regarded as horror films, not necessarily because of how they scare you, but how they use themes in a scary setting and leave you thinking after the film is done. In the modern day, the biggest directors of elevated horror are Jordan Peele and Ari Aster. Jordan Peele's films bring direct social commentary about race, and Ari Aster's films surround ideas of grief and trauma, with both directors exploring their themes in a way that's more about slow-burn horror and using scary images to convey an emotion. It's hard to classify this as a specific genre or a specific period of the horror movie genre, but it's clear that movies like Get Out and Hereditary are different from films like Blair Witch Project or Final Destination. It's hard to exactly define the style of modern horror films while they're being made, but it's interesting to see a new approach to the genre and more favorable views on the genre by critics compared to the past. Currently, only 6 horror films have been nominated for the Best Picture, and only one film, Silence of the Lambs, won Best Picture, but it's possible that could change in the near future with more films getting nominated dominated, including Get Out and The Substance. Although the term elevated horror has become more prevalent recently, I don't think it's an entirely new idea, but rather just a modern prioritization of this slow burn horror style. Horror movies have changed a lot in the 100+ years since early silent horror, but they still retain some of the same elements. As filmmaking technology becomes more advanced, the characters in these horror movies become more complex and more grounded as opposed to supernatural. You can see this clearly by comparing the complexity of Count Orlok in 1922 to Dracula in 1931, and comparing that to Leatherface in 1974. Despite this change in how horror villains are portrayed, there are still common elements that are integral to the genre, with the most clear example of this being how the monsters in films are representative of fears of society, and this fear sets up the themes of the film. You can look at Godzilla in 1954 representing the fear of the atomic bomb, and Get Out in 2017 representing a fear of racism. Similarly, the fear of science going too far in Frankenstein is reinterpreted for a modern audience with Jurassic Park. The way horror movies have evolved from silent films to the modern day is interesting to me, and I'm curious to know which period of horror is your favorite, so let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more videos every other week.